Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's Society of Decision Professionals Learning Exchange. My name is Hilda Chorekjian, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's presentation titled Integrated Decision Making in the United States Marine Corps. I would now like to introduce you to the speakers you will be hearing from today. Our featured speaker for today is Meredith Brown. Meredith is a Senior Development Planner for Shell Exploration and Production Company in Houston, Texas. She assists with developing strategic plans for assets and coaches the asset leadership team through decisions. She has been with Shell for almost 2 years. Meredith began learning the Marine Corps' disciplined approach to decision-making and how to be a decision-maker when she stepped off the bus on Parris Island and entered recruit training in 1988. Meredith, welcome to today's Learning Exchange.
Thank you, Hilda. I'm delighted to be here.
Our moderator for today's presentation is Raymond Fong. Raymond is currently Manager of Development Planning at the Center of Excellence for Exploration and Development Opportunity Realization, Project Integration, and Decision Quality within Shell International Houston. At Shell, Raymond has been involved in Shell's deepwater strategy and upstream development planning and had management roles in deepwater exploration and development projects, as well as onshore enhanced oil recovery. Raymond is a board member of the Society of Decision Professionals and currently co-chairs its program council. Raymond, welcome to today's Learning Exchange.
Thank you, Hilda. I'm very excited to be here as well.
Raymond will facilitate your questions throughout the presentation and raise some to our speaker to address live during and at the end of the webinar. And now, without any further delay, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to our featured speaker, Meredith Brown. Meredith, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hilda. Today's presentation is about decision-making in the Marine Corps, and the decision-making in the Marine Corps is very closely integrated with its planning process. The agenda, I'm going to introduce leadership as the Marine Corps because decision-making begins as a part of the training that Marines go through as leaders, how it's integrated with our planning processes, and we do have more than one depending on the complexity of the problem. And decision-making is fully integrated in everything we do. I'm going to explain how it is part of our culture. We're going to have a slight refresher on strategic decision groups, decision quality, just as a note of comparison between the two primary processes. The primary process for the Marine Corps on a strategic or operational level is Marine Corps planning process. For operational and tactical levels, we use the rapid response planning process. For a tactical level decision-making, we use BANSYS, which is an acronym, but we'll go over it in more detail later in the brief. And then finally, our most immediate, must be executed within minutes decision process is the Observe-Orient-Decide-Act loop. At the end, we'll have questions and answers. First and foremost, leadership. As you can see to the left of this slide, decisiveness is one of the 14 leadership traits that they emphasize in Marine Corps boot camp and officer candidate school. When you step into those yellow footprints that you see to the right, you begin to learn right then and there leadership and decision-making. The 13th Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Lejeune, decided to introduce formal leadership training into initial training of officer candidate school and boot camp through indoctrination, instruction, and experience. One of the ways in which they ensure Marines and recruits and candidates get the experience is by designating different individuals each day in a leadership role, such as squad leader, platoon guide, or a fire team leader. This training is enforced by our culture and our commitment structure as it leads to success when executing our mission. This approach is mission critical due to its efficiency, having both an integrated planning and decision-making process that everybody knows and understands as a common language is what makes it so efficient. I believe this is what makes the Marine Corps decision-making process unique compared to corporations. So here's the slide comparing the primary planning process, Marine Corps planning process to the right, and then SDG's decision quality chain to the left. They're very similar in many ways, but there are differences too, and I will be sure to point out these differences as we go through the slides. The planning process itself is an integrated and disciplined approach for strategic and operational level planning. The three key elements are top-down planning, the single battle concept, for the strategic level, and also known as a three-block war for the operational and tactical levels, integrated planning, and the commander's participation using his intent and guidance. For top-down planning, the commander is responsible for driving the process. He makes his decisions throughout the process along the way, articulated through his guidance and intent, and then through each step of the chain. The single battle concept is a concept of indivisible entity on the battlefield. In other words, we have to be aware of what we do is going to create some ripple effects throughout the region. The commander's intent, that's a term you're going to hear frequently because it is often used and modified as the problem is studied and decisions are made. It prepares the Marines for the single battle through the commander's intent. It provides the subordinates with a larger context so that they can exercise judgment and initiative, particularly in the absence of follow-on orders. Integrated planning is basically making sure you have the right people in the room from the right organizations. By doing this, we ensure that we consider relevant factors, we reduce omissions, and we share information as broadly as possible. So the first step is design. Design is a continuous activity. That's why it's in the center of the chain. It must never be viewed as an isolated event. The design is an articulation of the framework for solving the problem. It's the commander's vision of the operation. For example, during Operation Iraqi Freedom II, General Mattis, who was the Marine general in charge of Anbar Province, set his design based on three segments of the population that he thought would be most important, and they were the tribes, the former regime elements, and foreign fighters. He also further articulated the design by indicating that the tribes and the former regime element members who wish to be reconciled back with the government should be reconciled in a peaceful manner, and that we should neutralize the foreign fighters and those foreign regime elements that did not wish to be reconciled back to the government.
Hilda, Meredith, at this point there's some questions. Maybe this is a good point to bring some of them up. The strategic decision group, decision quality chain, is very much something that they present at a strategic level. And you said earlier that the decision-making process and the Marine Corps planning process is something that you use both at the strategic, the technical, and the operational level. Could you perhaps say a few words about what the Marine Corps means by strategic, technical, and operational? And are you going to touch upon how the planning process looks differently at these different levels?
Yes, so the strategic level for us, strategy is on a timeline 3 to 5 years out. It can also be with respect to the region in which it's going to affect. It's not just a city block or a city or even a province, if you will, from a geographical perspective. The strategic picture geographically would be that region, so the Middle East region. What could be done as an event in a city block may influence the behaviors of the population that we're trying to gain the trust of throughout the region. So the Marine Corps planning process is used on a strategic level at that point. However, when we get into the rapid response planning process, you'll see how parts of it are integrated even more closely to make the timeline more compressed so that it can be used in an operational sense. I know in the civilian world they have it's strategic, tactical, and operational. In the military, it's strategic is the long picture, the long view picture. Operational is the midterm, and tactical is the near term. Does that answer your question?
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
The step one problem framing, which is one that for those of us who are familiar with decision quality, they're probably familiar with this step as well. It is very similar in that in decision quality, we issue an opportunity statement. In the Marine Corps planning process, we issue a mission statement. But what's really important here is that the commander issues his initial intent and guidance at this step, which, in other words, he's making decisions as he begins to understand the environment and the nature of the problem as they go through this step. Now, that's not to say it won't be modified later, but it is key to note that his intent, he's starting to make decisions based on the information and declaring it through his intent. And And again, the commander's intent will provide subordinates with the larger context, enabling them to exercise judgment and initiative in the absence of orders. Course of action development. This is also very similar to decision quality in that this is when we start to select alternatives. This promotes understanding of the environment and the problem, which does tend to be a bit of a trend in the front end of this process. The courses of action must be suitable, feasible, acceptable, distinguishable, and complete. Several of the factors that we consider when determining courses of action is the mission, the enemy, terrain and weather, troops or forces, and the time available and support available to support the mission. At this point, as we end the alternative selection or the course of action development, the commander will issue his guidance for the next step so that people understand what values he wants presented as they compare the different courses of action. And that next step is called the course of action wargaming. Again, the purpose of this step is to examine and refine the different options that in light of the adversarial capabilities. The Marines will have teams formed up. One is an adversary team, one is a friendly force, and they act, react, counteract in order to identify gaps in capabilities, weaknesses for the enemy. It definitely refines the staff's estimate of support for concepts. It gives the commander a greater view of the problem once again to help them understand the environment. From the wargaming step, so this is basically an analysis. This is where we do some of our analysis.
Meredith, at this point, can I ask another question?
Yes, sir.
So as you said, the commander's intent and the role of the commander is very important and an integral part of the process in the Marine Corps. Can you say a little bit more, perhaps, about the role of the commander, if you could, in the Marine Corps, if you contrast it with, let's say, the role of the senior decision executive in a business context, and how is what you call the commander's intent similar to or different from the objective of let's say, a particular project that we might be executing, that the decision analysis process as set out by SDG would be applied to?
Well, the role of the commander, again, if you recall, he's responsible for this process because it's a top-down process. In other words, from the very beginning, he's articulating his vision by when he learns more about the environment and the problem, he begins to articulate his vision of how the mission can be accomplished, what the mission is, what forces could be used, and it works through this whole cycle of identifying the courses of action and analyzing them through the wargaming. Don't get me wrong, he's not in the room all the time micromanaging the staff as they work through the problem. That's not the case at all. But he is there at the beginning of each step in person to articulate his decisions, and he's there at the end of each step. He's called in order to review what the team has done and then to provide guidance for the next step. So, for example, the course of action development, he would come at the end of that, look at the different alternatives that were selected to decide whether or not they met his intent that he issued in the problem framing step and the design step. If they meet his intent and his guidance, then he gives further guidance on the wargaming analysis part, probably highlighting certain capabilities of the friendly force or trying to weed out what the weaknesses are of the adversary force. And then he departs the room and lets the staff do their business. Now, I've only been in the civilian corporate world for about 2 years, but I have noticed, compared to that, a marked absence of the decision maker. Oftentimes, the teams have to approach the decision maker to request guidance, and oftentimes the decision maker doesn't understand exactly what type of guidance they need to give.
Right.
And I believe it's because some of the initial training isn't the same, which is one thing the Marine Corps does, as I mentioned earlier.
So would it be fair to say, obviously this also depends on the corporate culture, that in the Marine Corps, the decision maker, i.e. the commander, is extremely proactive, whereas depending on different corporate cultures in the corporate environment, you might have more proactive or more reactive decision makers.
Right, exactly. And also, in the Marine Corps, the roles and responsibilities are very clearly delineated, and the decision maker is clearly identifiable. If for no other reason than he has the most rank on his collar.
Okay, that's another question, which has to do with the framing. So one of the things that you said as part of the cause of action, which we would call the alternatives, they must be suitable, feasible, acceptable. So when you do the problem framing, does the U.S. Marine Corps recognize different types of problems based on their solution space, and do you have like archetypes of problems?
Yes, we certainly identify different types of problems. For example, I was approached while on a deployment in the Embo province. I was approached by a general officer, and he said, "We have a lot of casualties in this area. I want you to help figure out what the real problem is, what the root cause of the problem is, who is supporting the insurgency there, and why." And the reason why he came to me was because my role was to develop civil society organizations and to work with women's affairs. As it turned out, there was a high population of widows in that area as well. And as we began to study the problem more closely, what we realized is that a lot of these widows, out of economic requirement, were supporting the insurgents because they would get paid to handle a lot of logistics, the feeding, allowing these insurgents to stay in their barn, or to hide things on their property, weapons or what have you. And so once we realized that these widows just needed a sustainable form of income, that was the root of the problem. And once we discovered that, well, years ago, 100 years ago, the answer would have been just go in and decimate the area with artillery or whatever. But that's not this real solution. The real solution was to go in and give them a sustainable means to gain an income. And what we had done, since it was a primarily agricultural area, we purchased some cows, gave one cow to each widow, made sure they were properly trained and taking care of the cow, and they already had a legacy of dairy work in the area, so the training was more advanced. It wasn't necessarily basic training. And then we assisted them in setting up a dairy cooperative that was based on the model of Land O'Lakes. We used Land O'Lakes as consultants. And they were able to set up this factory, and they had 2 or 3 products. So we had widows who had cows, they were selling their milk to this factory. This factory had a market because there was no other dairy providing this product in the area. So that's an example of how, when we look at the problem, we don't just study that there's a high rate of casualties here. The real problem was that these families didn't have a sustainable income. And once we presented those solutions, the casualty problem diminished.
It sounds a little bit, though, to me as well that, again, and it's probably the nature of the Marine Corps, that the commander plays a significant role in how the problem is framed and what type of solution space he or she would be looking for.
That's correct.
Okay.
But the commander is not opposed to good ideas from the bottom up.
Okay, so commanders are open to, let's say, they may have an idea of what the solution space might be, but if the people that are working the problem can say, well, actually the solution space could be completely different because we need to reframe the problem by looking at some root causes, as you just mentioned, that is a process that goes on, and the problem might be reframed then.
That's correct.
Okay. So hopefully that answers the question. So yes, thank you very much.
Okay, so comparison and decision, COA comparison and decision. Again, in the decision quality cycle, they have a trade-off step at step number 4, where they look at all the alternatives and the positives and negatives of each alternative. We do the same in the Marine Corps planning process. We compare each course of action, and the commander is looking, when he makes his decision, he is looking to see whether or not his guidance and commander's intent was used. And if it is used and there are still gaps, then they might have to go back to the course of action development step or the wargaming step, whichever step he feels the weakness lies in. Another comparison point to decision quality is the decision itself. In decision quality, they stop the chain at commit to action. Here in the Marine Corps planning process, it's an overt declaration of a decision will be made, which I think is unusual with respect to corporate America as well. Pardon me while I experience some technical difficulties. The next step is orders development. This is an opportunity for the commander to actually begin to see his decisions unfold. Orders development is when we actually write the plan, and in that we do some reconciliation, crosswalk, and then the commander approves the plan. The reconciliation is important because it ensures that the basic order and all the appendices are complete and in agreement with the units that will execute the decisions. The crosswalk is important because it makes sure that we have our plan and strategy nested into higher headquarters and that it's aligned with any friendly forces outside of the unit that we may be operating with. A key point to orders development is that the standard operating procedures of the unit are critical in producing a concise order, because in this step, it's not the number of pages that are written, it's about the content. So we don't want to put in information that's contained in the standard operation procedure that the unit is already aware of and the members of the unit already know how to execute. The final step is the transition step. And in this step, we begin to do rehearsals, we begin to deliver briefs. Again, it's just a more clear way that the commander can see that his decision is being executed. He has the opportunity to observe and identify any gaps in the plan, to learn how the subordinate commanders plan to accomplish their missions. He can confirm understanding of his commander intent. He confirms the understanding of the specific tasks that must be accomplished and the purpose of those tasks. And he makes sure, again, that the relationship with other units that he will be serving with in the particular operation are understood and they're linked in appropriately. During one experience, when I was deployed aboard a ship, we were being prepared to go into Côte d'Ivoire to do a rescue out of the embassy. Things were getting a little heated, and the State Department wanted to make sure that we were ready to go in and take the embassy personnel out and aboard the ship if necessary. Well, while we went through this whole planning process, and in the transition phase, we had used some 3D models that were built of the embassy compound. The Marines were studying this model to make sure they understood where they needed to be, when they needed to be there, beside what building, behind what wall, etc. Well, during that rehearsal, a junior Marine, a staff sergeant, approached the commander and said, "Sir, there's a problem with the model. My last unit was at that embassy. I was an embassy guard there, and the compound has changed. The model you're using is an old model. There's more distance between the walls. The front wall is now closer to the street. This building has been collapsed and removed. The other building has been expanded." And that made a big difference in how we were going to execute that mission. So the transition step was critical in identifying that gap. And the staff sergeant, who is an E6 or a technician, if you will, had the courage to approach the colonel and say, "Sir, there's a problem, and this is what it is." And it allowed us to go back and redevelop some of our courses of action.
Meredith, again, at this point, there's a couple of questions, so would it be maybe good to pause and to kind of look at those? The first one is around again, looking at the decision quality process by SDP, by SDG. If you look at that process, the whole idea is that you make decisions and you cannot define the quality of the decision by its outcome. So that's why you look at the different elements. How does the Marine Corps look at that? Is there an acknowledgement of where the process and the outcome is in this framework? And what do they regard? Is there an equivalent of the quality of the decision, and how is the quality of the decision different from its ultimate outcome, if it is?
Yes, it's well understood in the Marine Corps that the outcome is not indicative of a quality decision. That is very much understood. And the reason why that is because uncertainties are realized as the plan is being executed. And as uncertainties are realized and new information is revealed, you might have to change your course of action. And we'll get into that as well in the last in the last process that we use. But what it does is it does permit us, if we have time from a strategic level, we can reframe particular problems. If we don't have time, if it's really an on-the-ground sort of uncertainties are realized, in other words, you might think the enemy is in one building closer to you just to find out that he is actually farther away, and what do you do in that case? And again, we'll touch on that with the OODA Loop. But how do you measure that? It's tough, and I know that it's tough as well in the corporate world. What we do is if the plan is executed and things are going, even if they're going poorly in that you're taking more casualties or you're not able to get into a humanitarian assistance location as you had planned to, we just revise the plan, and sometimes we have to do it off the cuff or on the fly. But we do look at the quality of the decision in terms of what was the steps taken. Was this a decision that was made with rigor and discipline, or did somebody just do it on an impulse? As we look back, and typically these come out through after-action reviews. At the end of an operation or an exercise, we do after-action reviews and find where the uncertainties were realized that made us depart from the decision that was taken by the commander. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe another question, a few words on the role of, in the corporate world, what's the corporate world called the decision board. So as you know, in SDG, there's kind of the two sides of the coin, and the decision quality on the one side, and then this interaction between the working team and the decision maker or the decision makers on the other side, called the decision board, which is called the decision dialogue process. How does this work in the Marine Corps? Is there, obviously there's probably much more clear line of sight, but is there such a thing as a decision board when there's multiple parts of the military that have to be involved in an operation, and how's that implemented?
Well, so in the Marine Corps, there's only one commander, and he has key staff members who provide input into his decisions. But he is ultimately the decision maker and is responsible for the decision. However, in our internal processes, such as promotion boards, it is a board, and everybody's vote is equally weighed. So that would be a decision review board as to whether or not a particular candidate of promotion is qualified and should be selected. There's also, when we do joint operations with the Army, let's say, and the generals get together, even if they are same in rank, one of them is designated as the operational commander. So in the end, there's only just one commander, because even on the promotion board, if they were to get locked into a tie, there's a senior officer who is the tiebreaker.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, I just wanted to ask if that answered your question.
Yes.
Great. The rapid response planning process is an operational and tactical level process. And essentially, it's the Marine Corps planning process that is reduced in terms of the first 2 to 3 steps. And I say reduced in that when the expeditionary units, like the one you see in the picture aboard the ships, when they deploy, before they deploy, they study the region in which they're going to deploy to see if there's any current problems that they may have to participate in from a military perspective. They also consider any emerging problems before they get on the ship to see if there's a potential that they could participate in as well. They come up with a draft list of alternatives or courses of action. That would be the development. They will lightly wargame or analyze those, and then the commander, he doesn't make his decision on what he wants to do at that time. So we basically stop at step 4 in the process, the course of action, comparison, and decision. But the pre-work is done, if you will. The templates are pre-populated. It's a warm start when this planning process occurs because, again, from the time we receive the mission to the time we get to execute, there's only 6 hours. And the rapid response planning process allows us to plan less, using less time, so that we have more time to prepare for the mission. But the absolute critical piece of this is making sure that the units know intimately their standard operation procedures. It removes uncertainty about the unit's capabilities, and it helps the commander making his decision as he sees them exercising their operating procedures. And one experience that I had was during the attacks of 9/11. I was on a ship in the Combat Operations Center, and the majority of the unit was deployed into Kosovo. And I literally watched on the television, because as it says on the slide, we use open source news to help us gain intelligence. And so I literally watched the attacks on the television, and as I was watching, the phone rang, and it happened to have been the commander who was ashore in Kosovo, just wanting to check in with the duty officer, because I was the duty, to see what was going on. And I told him, I said, sir, I'm standing here watching our country being attacked. So I described to him what was happening. He took that information. They reviewed it from intelligence sources there. He contacted higher headquarters to see if there was potential that we might get deployed to another region. He was told yes. So within 6 hours, we exercised this particular process to redeploy 1,000 Marines from Kosovo back aboard the ship. The ship had to move from Turkey closer to the Kosovo region in order to collect those Marines. And then we sailed in the region in which we thought we were going to have to exercise another operation. And all that occurred within the 6-hour window. Oh, and by the way, I'm actually in this picture. I'm standing in the number 2, sort of in one of the corners closest to the mainframe of the ship. BAMSIS. BAMSIS stands for Begin the Planning, Arrange for the Reconnaissance and Coordination, Make the Reconnaissance, Complete the Plan, Issue the Order, and Supervise. This is one of the decision-making processes that we initially teach to the really junior Marines, the second and first lieutenants for officers, and sergeants and below for the enlisted Marines. This is an important planning and decision-making process for them because all the plans trickle down and is appropriate for each commensurate level for the Marines. And this one gives them the ability to study the problem from their perspective, what their role is in it, and to complete their plan. But most importantly, the most important step in this process is supervise, the supervision. That's another area that I find there's a departure between the Marine Corps and the corporate world. But BAMSIS also goes back to General Lejeun's philosophy of indoctrinate, instruct, and experience to Marines. We use this process in everything we do for the junior Marines to give them the practice and experience in making decisions. We finally come to the OODA Loop. The OODA Loop was created by Colonel Boyd. He was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. And it was his way of making immediate responses against enemy aircraft. It has to be performed within minutes, sometimes even seconds. It's the person who goes to the OODA Loop first, so the first step is to observe, the second step is to orient, the third step is to decide, and the fourth step is to act. Whoever goes around the loop the fastest and the most often wins. That's the philosophy behind it. And some of us do this already and we don't realize it. You might use this decision-making process in traffic, for example. I had to use it once while deployed to Anbar. I was finishing a meeting with an Iraqi counterpart when gunfire erupted, and my personal security detachment came to me. He was a sergeant, and he said, "Ma'am, we're taking fire." So my question was, are we taking fire or is somebody just shooting? And he wasn't sure. So as we were going back towards the convoy, we observed that we had ammunition being fired at us from 2 different directions. We oriented to discover which was the quickest egress route, because remember, my mission there wasn't to engage the enemy, especially when we couldn't see the enemy because of the potential collateral damage. My mission there was to win the trust of the people so that we could re-enfranchise them into the government. So I told the Marine to hold fire. We oriented towards an egress route. I decided to take it without firing, and then we acted on that. In the end, it was the right thing to do because, as we learned later, on one end of the street was the Iraqi police. On the other end of the street was the Iraqi army. One of them had a negligent misfire, The other end thought they were getting shot at, so they returned fire. Then the other end of the road, those Iraqi policemen thought they were getting shot at, so they returned fire. So it was really, nobody died from what I understand, but it could have been a terrible case of fratricide. This process is used at all levels, from general officers on down. Again, it's an immediate process. Most of you probably use it without realizing it. So to start wrapping up, planning and decision-making for Marines goes hand in hand. It's very integrated form. We cannot separate the two. And in order to communicate our decisions, we use a format that we call SMEAC, which you can see in the second bullet under McTP, third bullet under rapid response planning process. And that stands for situation, mission, execution, administration and logistics, and command and signal. That format is used because it's concise. It clearly articulates the decision that needs to be made and how to execute it. Again, the decision-making process in the Marine Corps is at all levels. The commander and his involvement is critical to success because he articulates his vision. He lets us know what his values are for trade-offs. He makes the decision, and then he sees the gaps that are identified as the decision begins to be executed in the orders development and transition steps. Defining goals and responsibilities are really critical as well. In the corporate world, I think oftentimes, particularly after transitions, those roles aren't well defined, and it's difficult for decisions to be made. It's difficult for problems to be studied. Even a simple event such as unit fitness programs, we send down to the lower level Marines, the sergeants and below, in order to get them to start practicing their decision-making skills. So these processes are really they make up the cultural fabric of the Marine Corps. It's a habit. It becomes routine. It becomes second nature. It's the philosophy of the Marine Corps. To grow leaders, they have to know how to make decisions. And that starts in day one when they step into the yellow footprint. That's all I have. Raymond, are there any other questions?
Yeah, there are some questions, and maybe I can ask one of the questions ask us to clarify this. So one of the questions is, how does the United States Marine Corps basic training instill what the question asker calls implicit C2 in the OODA Loop?
Implicit C2?
Yes, I'd like to have a little bit of a clarification on that as well.
So maybe that person means command and control.
That could be, yeah.
Okay, so in an OODA Loop situation, command and control is pushed down to the lowest levels. And the commander is oftentimes the fire team leader. And a fire team leader could be a lance corporal. And that's the Marine who's doing the observing and the orienting and the deciding. And he will communicate that to his team. And then, so as it goes up, for example, in the situation that I was in, I was the leader. I was the decision maker. I began my observations by asking the sergeant, what do you know right now about this situation? And he knew very little. He just knew that we were taking on fire. But we also noted that it was coming from two separate directions. Unfortunately, we were just in the middle. So it was my responsibility to observe, and part of that observation was, what is my mission? My mission is not here to engage the enemy if it's not necessary unless we're in dire straits. And that was a good observation that I instinctively made because we were not being engaged by the enemy. It was just an example of poor trigger control, frankly. It's in the orientation of, again, that's the decision maker's responsibility, the command and control. Which way is the egress route? There it is. We're going to take it, move. And that's what we do. So one thing that has to be understood about the Marine Corps as well, if you see two Marines of the same rank walking side by side, guaranteed one of them is in charge. One of them is the leader. If not by seniority, then just by experience and force of personality. And that's just understood in the Marine Corps. It's part of the culture. Typically, the Marine who's in charge is the one who does make the better decisions or who at least has a stronger decision-making skill. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Then there's a question that I have a lot of interest in as well, and it goes back to the discussion that you and I had earlier around exit strategies and the consideration of the exit strategies at various levels by the Marine Corps. Because as I understood it, it's a part and parcel of how you make decisions and how you frame up your problems.
Yes. Well, so as Marines, we're never going into a location without having an exit strategy, because we realize we're not going to be there forever, whether it's a combat mission, a humanitarian assistance mission, a technical recovery of an aircraft personnel mission, or an embassy mission. So part of the plan is the egress, the exit strategy. And you have to, on a strategic level, the first thing that we have to do is define success. When do we know our mission is accomplished? Because when our mission is accomplished, it's time to leave. It's time to move out. And the only way that you know your mission is accomplished is when you define success. And 2008, after what they called the Sahawa, or the enlightening, had occurred amongst particularly the tribes in Anbar province, and they reconciled themselves with the government. Some of them became government officials. Some of the sheikhs did. They reconciled themselves and partnered with the American forces. We realized this is sustainable. The economy here is better. It's not great, but it's better. We have government agencies in place. They understand what they're doing. The tribes are getting along. We have achieved our success and accomplished our mission. It's time to leave. And then in 2009, that's what they spent the year doing. They spent the year of 2009 packing up and leaving. Exit strategy. Does that answer your question, Raymond?
Yes, it does. So, yeah, I think that answers all the questions. So I'd like to end, Meredith, by thanking you very much on behalf of the Society for Decision Professionals and on behalf of the Program Council for this very interesting presentation. I think you've put your email on the last slide, so I assume that if people have some more questions, they can contact you via this email. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, sir. Definitely. I'm open to questions for sure.
Okay, so with that, this concludes our presentation, and I'd like to give the floor back to Hilda.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's learning exchange. I'd like to thank our presenters for their time and contributions to today's event. We hope you find this webinar informational. Our webinars are open to anyone without charge. They are free because of the support of those who paid forward to enable you to attend. To continue the chain of giving and to ensure we can continue this open access webinar series, we invite you to pay it forward and support our next webinar. You may do so via this link on our website at www.decisionprofessionals.com. I want to remind you that you can download a copy of today's presentation by clicking on the handout icon in the upper right of the menu bar, selecting the file, and clicking download. Alternatively, you may select from the bottom right menu, print to PDF. Thank you for being with us today, and you may now disconnect.